the Hudson Library and Historical Society's Artist Biographical Series presents art historian Felicia Zavarella Stadelman, speaking about American artist Andrew Wyeth and the three generations of Wyeth family artists. Recorded at the Hudson Library's Flood Meeting Room on October 30th, 2014.
Good evening and welcome to the Hudson Library. Tonight continues our fall series of featured artists. I would like to welcome back Felicia Zavarella Stadelman as she presents her series of artist biographical lectures through the eyes of the artist. Tonight she will speak on Andrew Wyeth and the Wyeth dynasty that went on for generations. Thank you.
Hello. Well, I'm sure you're looking at me wondering what exactly is she doing with her hair these days. I think you've seen everything from shiny bald to I don't know what that was before and then crazy. I've gotten now 3 months worth of diagnosis of no evidence of disease. After, this crazy stage 4 several times over, so my doctors have interviewed me on and off. I'm just telling you guys because you're my friends, but wondering what's going on because it went from stage 4 to stage 0. And so I've decided to accept it and go back to my original look. And I'm not sure about the curl, but we'll figure this out. So bear with me. Every time you see me, I'm going to look just a little different until I figure out what's going on. The Wyeth family of artists is synonymous with the American artistic dynasty. The great illustrator N.C. Wyeth found giants in the clouds and inspiration in the classics of fiction and history. And like any old master, he founded and trained a fine family of artists. The spreading power of the great illustrator's work is beyond calculation. It's a force that works in hidden ways and eludes any attempt at measurement. So it certainly has been the case of N.C. Wyeth. He was a great, unmistakable personality, a man of enormous energy and great talents, and he possessed a breathtaking imagination. Constant and grand were the words that were used to describe him over and over, which he poured into a series of dynamic pictures like Giants in the Clouds and The Lookout. He illustrated most of the great children's classics with a fire that kindled sparks in tens of thousands of young minds. These books have been kept in print by publishers even today. These classics have sold in the multi-millions worldwide. And during his very prestigious career, NC produced some 5,000 works of art for magazines, advertisements, posters, and he also published 125 books on his own, N.C. Wyeth. He created a legend which has grown steadily since his death, and no less importantly, he sired a remarkably gifted family. Now, although in recent years the public attention has been focused largely on N.C. Wyeth's son, Andrew, there's been an array of strong talents working beside him and his family and behind him, and he kind of looms as this extraordinary figure of a man. Now, I don't really know any other way to show this, so I do it visually, and this is the only way that I think gives it the most impact. This is N.C. Wyeth, and these are all the people in his family. Hang on, we got a few more down there. That he either trained, inspired, worked with, that are all artists as their trade. Amazing. I think someone counted 14, if you did that really quick. Andrew worshipped and feared his father, N.C. He made him his role model, and he also swore never to be like him. Even in N.C.'s death, his spirit permeated Andrew's world. N.C. Wyeth was a daunting collision of opposites, his daughters would say. They described him as two men fighting in a sack. That was his personality. Family tales always blame the two poles of his personality on heredity. His grandfather was French-Swiss, and his grandmother was Swiss-German. So NC's grandparents met in Neuchâtel, which was on the transition line between those two areas of Switzerland. And his grandfather was a horticulturist. He immigrated to America in 1855. He ended up in Needham, Massachusetts, where he had extensive greenhouses, and he invented a widely copied pressurized hot water heating system that greenhouses still use today. That's N.C. Wyeth's grandfather. The Wyeth family became granite, solid, Puritan New Englanders. They helped construct early buildings at Harvard College in Cambridge. The Wyeths were at the Deerfield Massacre, at the Boston Tea Party, in Lexington. They were active in the War of 1812, and many of them died in the Civil War. Newell Convers Wyeth, N.C. Wyeth, was born in Needham, Massachusetts on October 22nd, 1882. He was the first of four sons born to Andrew and Henrietta, and they strongly encouraged his interest in drawing from childhood. Now, Wyeth first studied at the Massachusetts Art School, which eventually became the Eric Pape School of Art, and he spent his winter and springs in 1902 working in Boston as an illustrator, and he submitted his portfolio to Howard Pyle for consideration, and Howard Pyle accepted him as a student. So in 1902, at the age of 20, N.C. Wyeth traveled from Needham, Massachusetts, south of Boston, to join Howard Pyle in his two-year-long art school that they offered to N.C. Wyeth, and that was in Chadds Pennsylvania. So during the summers, they spent their summers in Wilmington, Delaware, and then in the winters, they went to Chadds Pennsylvania. That's where the school was. Now, Pyle was considered the country's foremost teacher. And he was the Dean of American Illustrators in an era before the popularization of photography, when magazines and books depended on illustrators to give us their imaginations and enhance our reading. In addition to painting, Pyle taught young NC to be kind of a taskmaster. NC would write how Pyle did reach in and down and fairly tear at my weak spots. It was like salt on an open sore, but it cleansed and healed me. Now, through Pyle's close association with major publishers, he obtained a lot of illustration work for his students, and Wyeth's success went way beyond Pyle's imagination. In Howard Pyle's tradition of painting authentically, Wyeth was sent by the Saturday Evening Post to the Southwest in the fall of 1904 to study the culture. And for 3 months, he went there and he herded sheep. He lived with the Indians. He worked as a mail carrier in his free time. And he documented all of his experiences in pencil and paint from 1905 to 1908. And he published illustrations that were mostly in the Western theme during this time. After graduation from the Pyle School, he remained in Wilmington under his mentor's halo, he would say. Now, on a sleigh ride in 1904, he met 17-year-old Carolyn Bacchus, and this is how NC describes her. She was flirtatious, very slender, very straight, 5 feet 4 inches with a lovely neck and head, large, dark, roguish eyes framed by masses of chestnut hair, an authentic beauty. She was unsophisticated and yet charming, he said. She was one of 10 children in a Wilmington family that had fallen on bad times. Now, NC married Carolyn 2 years later in 1906. And then in 1911, he received his first book commission to illustrate Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island. Incidentally, this book is still in print. You can still buy it with the illustrations by N.C. Wyeth. The greatest illustrator during his time, he was one of the greatest, and he's still very famous for his Blood and Thunder pictures, the illustrations he did for Kidnapped, Robin Hood, The Last of the Mohicans, Robinson Crusoe, as well as Black Arrow. Now, with $500, the advance that he got from Schreibner's for his illustrations for Treasure Island, he made a down payment on 1.5 acres of land in Chadds Ford, where he built a house and a studio. And he wrote in his memoirs, "In this little corner of the world, I will work out my destiny." Within a year, the couple moved from Wilmington to Chadds Ford, and he built a small, squarish, 2-story red brick house with white wood trim. It had a front porch, wood columns, and a portico. He said it kind of resembled a condensed mansion. Up on a hill, he built his spacious studio, which he always referred to as my church. Full throttle in every way, a hyper-idealist, he planned on creating the ultimate ideal family. Those were his words. He did find time to paint landscapes, incidentally, between busy workloads of illustration commissions for a number of different magazines and books. And he and Caroline raised 5 children there: Henrietta, Carolyn, Nathaniel, Anne, and Andrew. N.C. infused the house with his presence. He said, after reading much of the night, the manuscripts that he had to illustrate, I would rise at dawn and go immediately up to the studio, finishing my preliminary drawings by 7, and then I would boom on the grand piano to wake up the entire household. He made breakfast for the whole family, including gingerbread cookies, and incidentally, in your handout, I have N.C. Wyeth's original gingerbread cookie recipe. I know someone in this group is going to do it. Everywhere I give this lecture, someone will make the gingerbread cookies, bring them to me later. They're wonderful, incidentally. He would make them every single day for a snack for his family. And then he would not return to his studio until he said the house felt right, which meant that everyone was happy and involved in some kind of constructive play. His daughters remember him as a kindly tyrant. You had to do what you did with the utmost perfection. Kind of sounds like my dad, although in a good way. His children were taught to be voracious readers. Many of them can scan an entire page at one time, which he taught them how to do. They were all very precocious. They would compete in historical writings in a number of different kind of contests. Generally, they won them, although he never told them that they did. He was an extraordinary father, and they were a high-octane family. But they never attended one day of school. They were homeschooled by N.C. and Caroline. Now, N.C. set out to make his home a hothouse for the imagination, he said, a creative pod, untouched by outside influences. He said, each one of my children will be individually shaped according to his or her particular bent. This is what he says about school. He considered it to be contaminating. He said the sheep-like tendency of human society soon makes inroads on a child's unsophistication, and then popular education completes the dastardly work with systematic formulas, and away goes the individual, hurling through space into that hateful oblivion of mediocrity. They are pruned into stumps, one resembling the other without character, absent of grace. That's why he homeschooled his kids. There should actually be a book written about the things that N.C. Wyeth said. They were so profound, things I want to remember. He did, however, allow Nathaniel to continue to college and get his master's degree in engineering. But the simple life was the goal. Classical music was a routine part of their day, as was acting out all of the manuscripts that N.C. was working on. He was schooling the children to see through the eyes of their imagination, in his words. He frequently held family excursions to stimulate their powers of observation. He trained all of his children in art. He spent long, tedious hours with each one of them to develop their talent. Henrietta was the prodigy of the group. Anne was the gifted pianist. Her musical compositions became known as the family portraits. In the late 1920s, N.C. began enjoying some of the advantages to his success, and the attention that he got made him a celebrity, and he moved into a higher level of living, something that he referred to as the disease of sophistication. His illustrations gained a great deal of popularity. He acquired such trappings as a tennis court, a Cadillac, a butler, and a cook. His laundry was sent out, and he was shaved by the barber in town. So much for the simple life. He then, in his words, sentenced himself to whatever brought the money in, including considerable advertising work for Coca-Cola and Lucky Strike cigarettes. Now, celebrities were attracted to this remarkable family. Anne was an extremely popular pianist. Henrietta was an accomplished painter. She was commissioned by very many people to do their portraits. And this is what Andrew said about his father during this time of the Cadillacs and the tennis courts. He said, "What happened to Pa was Scott Fitzgerald." He insisted that the girls have a coming out party, and Henrietta became very social minded, lots of cocktail parties. So did Pa. This went on for 20 years. He was inseparable from his new crowd. This was the group he hung around with. Scott and Zelda, Lillian Gish, Eric Knight, who wrote the best-selling novel This Above All. He's also responsible for creating the character Lassie, Eric Knight. The great actor, romantic lead Douglas Fairbanks was one of his best friends, and also Mary Pickford, who would beg NC regularly in letters to come to Hollywood. But NC refused, he said, for the family's sake. And it was around this time that Andrew was beginning to come of age. The influx of outsiders, Andrew said, made him withdrawn, and he began to disappear into the countryside where he felt most comfortable. He said, "I developed sort of unconsciously on the outskirts of the family." Andrew Wyeth was born in Chadsford, 1917. He was the fifth child of artist N.C. Wyeth and wife Carolyn. And he was the youngest child, but he was born with a disjointed hip that caused his feet to point out whenever he walked. He was frequently ill. He was also anemic. He had chronic sinus infections, frequent bouts with whooping cough. He was considered too delicate to go to school. At this point, they would have considered maybe sending the youngest one to school. He was also educated at home, and he spent a great deal of his time making drawings, playing with his collections of toy soldiers. He had more than 2,000 toy soldiers at the time of his death, incidentally. And he roamed the woods and fields with his friends, and he always wore the costumes that his father used for the illustrations. Andrew lived in awe of this powerful, seemingly ominous father who was nurturing, but he had a very volatile temper. He had a carefully orchestrated household, and everyone had to live their part. Only the best music was allowed. Only the best poetry, best books were allowed in the house. Only the best fairy tales, toys, paints, drawing paper, and incidentally, only the best artwork was allowed to be produced by this family. Books were revered to a point that they must never touch the floor. Funny papers and magazines were banned. When NC caught his daughter Anne reading a movie magazine, she actually blushed in shame and was punished for it. Although Andrew said we were raised simply, we were raised to be little geniuses. Now, until Andrew's adolescence, his father provided him with no formal training instruction. Somehow, NC sensed that the quality of imagination in his son's drawings shouldn't be curbed quite at this point. Andrews created these pure fantasy illustrations. This is a very famous one that he did when he was very young, somewhere between 13 and 14 years old, with knights laying siege. And this is the one that impressed his father the most. NC felt that his son had reached the limit of what he could learn on his own after he observed this drawing. Andrew said art was in the air. But not so much for me, curiously enough. I was the youngest of 5 children. I was frail, unhealthy. I never went to formal school, but I was tutored, and consequently, I fell on the outskirts of the family. My sisters, Henrietta and Caroline, who showed an early talent for painting, were brought in very quickly to the studio of my father. But I was almost forgotten, he said. So I played alone. I wandered a great deal over the hills, painting watercolors that literally exploded slapdash across my pages. I drew in pencil or ink in this wild, undisciplined manner. My earliest things were landscapes, hills near our house, romantic images of medieval castles, knights in armor, a lot of drawings of soldiers of the First World War. He said, then one evening when I was about 15 years old, he showed his father a miniature theater that he had made out of cardboard with painted scenery, and he told him about a play that he had written. His father looked at it rather casually at the time and offhandedly said, Andy, I think next week I want you to come up to the studio and draw from the casts and get started in academic training. This was October 19th, 1932. I want you to remember that date, October 19th. And Andrew entered his father's studio to begin academic training. He was 15 years old. Now, by all accounts, NC's tutorials were exacting and relentless. Andrew copied plaster casts over and over again. He made charcoal drawings of still life arrangements. He drew and redrew the human skeleton and drew it again from memory. These and other exercises was to teach him about solid technical mastery. He said my father was a terrific technician. He could take any medium and make the most of it. Once I was making a watercolor of some trees, and I made a careful drawing, and I was just filling in the lines. He came along and looked at it and said, Andy, you've got to free yourself. And then he took my brush, filled it with paint, and made sweeping brush strokes. I learned more in that few minutes of watching him than I ever did from anyone else, and it changed my life. After 2 years of instruction, his father set him loose. Now, the family used to spend their summers in Maine, and Andrew's first notable works of art after leaving his father's workshop were these watercolors that reflect kind of an influence of Winslow Homer. And he began producing them in the summer of 1936 when he was 19 years old. They're fluid, they're splashy, they were dashed off very rapidly. He once painted 8 of them in a single day. His father would say to him, if you have a red-hot impression, then you have to go with it. If you can catch a moment before you begin to think, then you've really got something. With no reservations whatsoever, NC would tell him that they represented the best watercolors he had ever seen. And NC showed these watercolors to an art dealer who agreed to exhibit them. On October 19th, that same date again, 1937, 5 years to the day after he entered his father's studio, he had his own New York City debut, his own one-man show. It was in the heart of the Depression, but the crowds packed the show, and it sold out on the second day. A phenomenal feat. At the age of 20, Andrew Wyeth had become a celebrity. He was also gradually emerging from his father's shadow, a process, he said, that was hastened by the arrival of a new person in my life, Betsy James. Now, Andrew met Betsy, whose family summered in Maine, not far from the Wyeths, in 1939. He proposed to her after they had only known each other for 1 week. She was not an artist herself, but she had grown up in a household that was preoccupied with art and design. He said, on my 22nd birthday, I met my wife, Betsy. One day I drove across the river to Gushing, where I had never been before. I heard about a man by the name of Merle James, who had a friend who bought a watercolor of mine. I don't know exactly why I did it on my 22nd birthday, but I drove over to meet him, and he was away, but I met his daughter, Betsy. That very day, she told me that she wanted to show me a marvelous house, and she drove me down to the Olsons. I met Christina for the first time. She was a very close friend of Betsy's since she was a little girl. Through the Olsons, he said, I really began to see New England as it was. They married in May of 1940, just a short year later. Andrew was 22 and Betsy was 18. This is how he describes her. Beautiful, sensitive, unconventional, intuitive, and highly intelligent. She not only managed my household affairs and raised our 2 children, Nicholas, who became an art dealer, and then Jamie, who was a much exhibited painter, currently a much exhibited painter and watercolorist. There was an article about him in the Wall Street Journal that someone just gave to me, so look it up if you can. But she also became Andrew's protector. his model, his principal artistic guide, and she took over the role that his father had performed so well. When sales were slow, Betsy insisted that he turn down any commercial illustration projects and just focus on painting. Andrew said Betsy made me into the painter that I would not have been otherwise. She didn't paint the pictures, she didn't get the ideas, but she made me see more clearly what I wanted. She was a terrific taskmaster, sharp and a genius at this kind of thing. He said I had severe training with my father, but I had even more severe training with Betsy. She galvanized me at a time when I needed it. By 1945 now, NC was now 65. He was shaken by World War II and what he called the lurid threats of world's dementia. He was losing confidence in himself as a painter. He became moody and depressed, brightening his colors. He flirted with different styles, but nothing seemed to really help. And he became more and more dependent on Andrew at this time, relying on him, his son, for encouragement and support. Now, in those years, Andrew and NC were experiencing kind of a role reversal. He was now encouraging his father. He was most grateful for what he had given him. And in Pennsylvania, when they lived near each other, Andrew would routinely end up at his father's studio, talking with him, lunching with him. He said, Andrew said, it was a very sad period for me. I knew Pa wasn't doing his best work, and I felt he needed a little bit of building up of his spirits. I hope that it helped him, but I don't think that it did. Now, in addition to his son, NC had another source of solace, and it was not his wife, Carolyn. According to Andrew and the rest of the family, Andrew said, my mother was a wonderful companion for my father. She let him have the life that he wanted, but I don't think she had the slightest idea of what he was doing. By the 1940s, she had entered menopause, Andrew said, and was sickly and lazy and heavy and whiny. Complained about the capabilities of the cook and the butler constantly. She had very little patience, Andrew said, for her husband's despondency. Ma thought that it was absolute nonsense. Now, Henrietta remembers all of Pa's questionings and self-criticism and his changes of philosophy had gone on year after year, and Ma finally became very bored with his constant nibbling and chewing at what is the meaning of life. And she wouldn't listen to it anymore. She put on weight, she read stories, and generally was in front of the Saturday Evening Post. In his early 60s, N.C. Wyeth found refuge from himself in a woman who gave him back his youth, he would say, and perhaps revived abandoned dreams. She was young, pretty, physically magnetic, with an intellectual, creative bent. He wrote in his journals, nobody really knew at this time who he was talking about. He said, she feeds my ego with admiration, with a fresh ear for my torrential feelings and ideas, the understanding listener that I needed all of my life. Once again, he had reason to live. Unfortunately, she was Caroline Wyeth, the wife of his son Nathaniel. Did you know that? I love when I teach you something new. You know, my goal is 5 things, so I think we're at maybe 2 right now. So N.C. Wyeth is having an affair with his daughter-in-law. She was an embryonic poet with a love of language, literature, and music. And Andrew said Nathaniel read very little. He was an engineer who analyzed how things worked, not ideas. She was a charmer who could be devastatingly abrupt, and she had not been warmly welcomed into the Wyeth clan. Early in their marriage, Nathaniel was transferred by DuPont to their explosives plant in New Jersey, and Caroline was lonely, felt uprooted from her friends and relatives. She said deprived of intellectual stimulation. And Betsy, Andrew's wife, explains that N.C. Wyeth wasn't getting a lot of flattery at the time in his life, in his work, in anything, and she was giving him all the flattery and doing it deliberately, Betsy said, to pay everybody back who didn't love her in the Wyeth family. She was going to take him away from his children, distract him, as if to say, Betsy said, you can't have him because you don't deserve him. I deserve that mind. And of course, there was a fascination with Howard Pyle, that N.C. Wyeth had kind of an obsession about him. It was a total obsession on his part, and Caroline was Howard Pyle's niece. There was something about Caroline's first son, born in November of 1941, after she and Nathaniel had difficulty conceiving. He was named Newell Convers after N.C. He was a fascinating and precocious child, N.C. would say, who at the age of 3 was listening to Rachmaninoff concertos and Beethoven and Tchaikovsky and discussing them with his grandfather. N.C. adored him. He would call him that gleaming child of color and spirit. Now, in the Wyeth family calendar, October 19th is a charged date. October 19th, 1902, N.C. Wyeth arrived in Wilmington and began studying with Howard Pyle. On October 19th, 1932, Andrew entered his father's studio for academic training, and on October 19th, 1937, Andrew had his first one-man show that opened up at the Macbeth Gallery in New York. On the morning of October 19th, 1945, N.C. was on an outing with his grandson, 5-year-old Newell Convers Wyeth, the child of his oldest son Nathaniel, and at a railroad crossing by the farm of a neighbor, the car that N.C. was driving stopped while straddling the tracks, nobody knows why. A mail train from Philadelphia plowed into it and killed N.C. Wyeth instantly, hurling the little boy into a cinder embankment, and he died of a broken neck. Just minutes before he died in Chadds Ford, Pennsylvania, he was overheard talking to his grandson about bundling shocks of corn. He said, "This is something you have to remember because this is something that is passing." It's an incident that's very compelling. Now, a year or so later, Betsy, Andrew's wife, picked up the woman who had been watching N.C. and his grandson in the cornfields that day. He was watching her and her husband. She told Betsy all about how N.C. stopped, brought the little boy over, and was talking to him about what she and her husband were doing and talking about paying attention, very close attention to this, because you might not see it again. Finally, they said goodbye. He returned to the car. She went back to work. About 3 minutes went by and they heard the crash. It's so ironic that he was killed so close to home. Andrew said he had talked to me a year before as we walked down that very railroad track at that same spot, and he showed me the spring where Howard Pyle students would stop along the railroad to get water, right at that crossing. It was October 19th, the same day that he had first arrived to study with Howard Pyle. That was the day he was killed. Shadowing the funeral rituals was the question of what actually happened at that railroad crossing. Did N.C. commit suicide? Virtually in unison, the family said he would never do that to that child. He absolutely adored him. And most of the family members surmised that that was really his son. Andrew agrees, but he said death was on his mind. And he points out that all of N.C.'s painting gear was carefully lined up in his studio that day, and on top of it was a Bible that lay open to a passage on adultery. Nathaniel, the young boy's father, the engineer, said the car's engine was choked by carbon. It tended to stall when accelerated at a low speed. In this scenario, the mail train didn't whistle. N.C. was at the crossing before they saw it coming. He jammed down on the accelerator. The engine failed. That was the only accepted answer that Nathaniel could understand. He said perhaps at this moment, N.C. was immobilized by a heart attack. Maybe that's what happened. His daughter, Henrietta, said he was miserably unhappy. He allowed himself to be careless. Things happen to you when you're careless. After that, Andrew's work changed dramatically. It became deeper, more serious, more intense. Andrew said, "It gave me a reason to paint. My father's death gave me an emotional reason to paint. I think it made me." And the incident inspired this 1940 painting called Winter, which depicts a young Lynch running down the hill being chased by his shadow. Andrew said about this, "The boy was me at a loss, my hand groping to free my soul." Every time that Andrew Wyeth put a hill in a painting, he said that was his father's chest, and he could feel it moving up and down. He would say, "It's not what you put in a painting, but it's what you leave out that counts." The painting is rendered with these tiny, meticulously strange, unpredictable strokes. The hill, he said, was the body of his father. He said, "I could feel it breathe." In the summer of 1948, Andrew began painting a severely crippled woman who was also placed on a hill. Christina Olson. He spent a lot of his time with her. Christina was a remarkable woman, and as was her brother Alvaro. He said they would let me wander all over through the house. I didn't have to have a formal studio. I used their upstairs rooms. The Olson house was my studio. I'd go down there by boat early in the morning and stay there all day long. The world of New England was in that house, he said. The emotional effect was very powerful on me, and he created Christina's world. Now, he said the idea was triggered in May when he happened to look out of a third-floor window from the Olson house, and he saw Christina dragging herself across the grass. Christina had a gradual, never diagnosed muscular deterioration that left the entire lower part of her body useless. Did anybody know that about Christina? That day, she was laboriously returning from a tiny garden, which is at the bottom, that he eliminated, and she cultivated flowers that she was going to use to decorate the rest of the house in the lower rooms. And Andrew saw her painfully pulling herself up this seemingly endless sloping hillside with her arms, and for months, he did nothing but the grass. And then eventually delineated all of the buildings at the top. There was an entire neighborhood up there that he just eliminated. Finally, he said, I came to the figure itself. Her body is turned away from us so that we get to simply through the twist in her torso, the clench of her right fist, and the tension of her right arm, also the slight disarray of her thick hair. He would say this about Christina: we had a great communion. We could go for hours without saying anything, and then sometimes we would do a great deal of talking. That's New England. She would cook over a wood stove. Sometimes she would get dirt all over her face, and I would wash her face for her. Sometimes I would comb her hair. I wasn't in awe of her, but she had remarkable eyes, penetrating eyes, and I became really fond of her as a friend. Here are some pictures of Christina. The top one is a painting that Andrew Wyeth did of her, and the bottom one on the right is a photograph of her and her brother Alvaro. Has anybody ever seen Christina before? The reality was there was a great deal of symbolism in this painting. He said, and these are his words, Christina was painting in a rage. I was furious that Betsy wanted to build that house in Gushing. I didn't want to be rooted there. I was afraid of getting in deep like my father in Port Clyde with that big house and the dock. And I'd go down to the Olsons every day and put all my heat and anger into that picture. I felt the tragedy of Christina. He said, then I decided, they're building that ridiculous house. I'm going to make this picture as powerful as I can with all the anger I can put into it. I have this hate within me, and you got to take it out in the medium that you're working in. That makes you struggle to push a picture even further beyond the call of duty, he said. He also said finishing the painting brought a sense of fatigue and letdown. When he was done, he hung it over the sofa in his living room, and nobody ever glanced at it, commented on it. His wife didn't like it at all. In October, when he shipped several paintings to a New York City gallery, he told his wife, that painting is completely flat. I'm just going to throw it in with the rest of the pictures. He could not have been more wrong. He shipped that painting to the New York City gallery, and powerful figures in finance and the art world were now all whispering about this remarkable painting from this small gallery, and they dropped by very quietly to take a look at it. Within 2 weeks, the painting had been purchased by the Metropolitan Museum of Modern Art. When it was hung there in December of 1948, thousands of people related to that picture in a personal way, and they had crowds coming to see this painting. Perhaps to the embarrassment of the curators, who tended to favor European art, it became one of the most important pieces of art ever to be seen in the gallery, one of the most popular works. Within a decade or so, the museum had banked reproduction fees from prints that amounted to tens of thousands of times the sum of $1,800 that they had paid to acquire the picture from that small gallery. Today, the value of this painting is measured in the millions. At the age of 31, Andrew Wyeth had accomplished something that eludes most painters, even some of the best, in an entire lifetime. He created an icon with this painting, a work that registers as an emotional and cultural reference point in the minds of millions. If you say Christina's World, everybody can see this picture in their head. Today, Christina's World is one of the two most familiar American paintings of the 20th century. Only Grant Wood with American Gothic has created a work of comparable stature. Now, Christina became famous. Tourists stalked her house, peered through her windows, took pictures of her, imitated that pose on the field. If you go onto Google, you'll see all kinds of people laying in that pose on the field. One morning, she woke up and found a stranger standing over her, and he said, "I'm a minister, that's okay. Your painting means a lot to me." When Andrew Wyeth told her about the myriad of symbolism that's read into Christina's World, she simply said, "People are silly." He said it's the difference between a picture that is profound art or just the painting of an object. And his paintings are filled with hidden metaphors that explore the common themes of memory, nostalgia, and loss. In 1950, 2 years after he painted Christina's World, he was diagnosed with a potentially fatal disease of bronchitis of his bronchial tubes. One of his lungs actually had to be removed because of this infection in his bronchial tubes. And during the operation, his heart began to fail, and he later had reported having a vision where he saw one of his artistic heroes, Albrecht Dürer, laying out his hand towards him and asking him to come with him. And Andrew said that he pulled back right away. The operation, however, severed muscles in his shoulder, and although he eventually recovered from the infection, it was unclear for a time whether he would ever paint again. During the weeks of recuperation, he took long walks through the fields wearing a pair of old boots that once belonged to Howard Pyle, that were his father's boots that he treasured, and that was his father's teacher and mentor. And he created a painting, a self-portrait that he called Trodden Weed, where he painted those boots on this hillside. And he felt that this was a mediation on the precariousness of life in this still life. Incidentally, after the surgery, his arm was supported by a sling, and because he couldn't lift his arm up and down, someone in his family created a suspension mechanism to the ceiling, and when he needed it to go up and down, he would simply use this mechanism to lift his arm. He said with this painting, it's a collection of personal feelings and memories of the charismatic Pyle, who greatly influenced both N.C. Wyeth and eventually Andrew Wyeth. He would dress up as characters from N.C. Wyeth's and Pyle's illustrations, and his vision of death appeared to him in the figure of Dürer, and incidentally, he said he was striding across the same field in the same boots. Now, by the time of his rehabilitation, he had achieved this signature look with this very distinctive, absent approach. All of his subjects, incidentally, were within a mile or two from the towns that he lived in. Chadds Ford, where he still spent the winters, and Cushing, Maine, where he would go in the summers. And when people would ask him why he used the same subject matter that was just close to home, he said, "I paint the things I know best." Many of his most memorable paintings in the 60s and 70s are just on two subjects. The Kerner family from Chadds Ford, that was a farm house that was owned by a German immigrant by the name of Karl Koerner and his mentally imbalanced wife, and the Olson house in Cushing, which was inhabited by Christina, who was crippled in a wheelchair, and her brother. Those were the only two subjects he painted from 1960 to 1970. Again, when he was asked about this, he said, "When you lose simplicity, you lose drama." Now, in 1950, an art critic praised Wyeth as a master of magic realist technique, without tricks or techniques or sentiment or obvious symbolism. Through his use of perspective, he could make a prosperous farmhouse kitchen or a rolling pasture as bleak and as haunting as a train whistle in the night. I'm not sure that was meant as a compliment. That same year, he was lauded as one of the greatest American artists when he was described as creating these haunting paintings, both at the same time. But as this battle line between realism and abstractionism were being drawn more rigidly in the mid-1960s, he was regularly cast off as an old-fashioned, rural, reactionary, sentimental artist. In 1963, he appeared in Life magazine on the cover as America's preeminent artist. That made him an even larger target. The writers were defending abstractionism and put him on the cover to criticize how missionary he had become. Many art historians believe that we just needed someone to attack at that time because we really didn't understand what was going on in art in 1963. Envy, I believe, many art historians believe, have also played a part. In 1959, he sold this painting called Groundhog Day to the Philadelphia Museum for $51,000, which was the largest sum that a museum had ever paid for a work by a living American artist. So a little bit of jealousy was going on as well. Through the 1970s and 1980s, he kept a steady stream of major paintings, landscapes, trees, boulders, studies, but above all, he made likenesses of the people that he knew, his friends in Maine, the fisherman, Walt Anderson, his Pennsylvania neighbors, Jimmy and Johnny Lynch, were all part of his repertoire. And then in 1986, he revealed the existence of 246 sketches, studies, drawings, and paintings of his married neighbor, Helga, who was 22 years his junior, Helga Testorf. These are called, and they're forever known as, the Helga pictures. They're a fantastic compilation of tempera and dry brush paintings, watercolors, pencil studies, and they were secretly created over the span of 15 years. He created these images between 1971 and 1985 without telling a single person that he was creating them, including his wife. He stated, "I would not have been able to have finished the project with everyone looking at it." Now, Prussian-born Helga Testorf was 32 when she met Andrew Wyeth. They met when she was helping to look after a friend of Wyeth's who had been a subject for some of his works. And she had never modeled before. She agreed to become his subject. And what started out as an acquaintance evolved into a long-time friendship. She enjoyed the long, pensive hours that she spent modeling for him. She said, "I became comfortable with him. He would often paint me while I was sleeping." The Helga pictures depict a persistence of vision and a technique from a perspective that's both objective as well as personal. They were not meant to be psychological portraits, Andrew said. It was just simply the study of the effects of light on a woman's body. Simple. He often focused on a particular element or a motif, like her radiant reddish blonde hair, the light that describes the curve of her body, and left the rest of the image unfinished. He painted her in his studio at the Olsons, in the shadows, in the sunlight, during every season, every time of day. He painted her clothed, nude, awake, asleep, in every possible combination. For her part, Betsy didn't seem very surprised. She said this of the Helga pictures: "I don't pry into his life and he doesn't pry into mine." Now, this revelation, many people found very hard to believe, that he could have produced so many paintings without his wife's knowledge, without anyone's knowledge, incidentally. And that thrust him onto the cover of both Time and Newsweek magazine. The stories hold on popular imagination, and the fact that he wound up on Time magazine because of these pictures proved that he was an artist whose style and personality still tantalized America. John Tesdorf, Helga's husband, was out of the country at the time of the Helga painting reveal. He was also unaware of their existence, and when he returned to America, he was very surprised to see his wife on the cover of Time magazine at the airport. When they asked Andrew Wyeth about that, he said, "Secrecy is the key to freedom." Now, an exhibition of the works at the National Gallery in Washington followed 10 months later, but the revelation now was seen as a hoax or a publicity stunt. In 1997, a book called American Vision, written by Robert Hughes, calls this a masterpiece of art world hype. So he was asked, why did he keep the painting secret? He said, "I'd been painting houses, barns, and all of a sudden I saw this girl and I said, my God, if I could get her to pose, she personifies everything I feel, simplicity, and that's it. I'm not going to tell anyone about this, I'm just going to paint it." People would say to him, "You must have been having sex with her." He said, "Like hell I was painting, and it took all my energy to paint." Now, this is what he said of his wife, Betsy. "She's a very strong-willed woman, but I've got to go my own way. People think that Helga was cooked up by me and Betsy, but I did it on my own because I wanted to do something completely by myself. A man gets to the point where he's just got to do something and not let anyone else stand in his way." In any case, many people in the New York art world seized on these Helga pictures as a confirmation in the belief that Andrew Wyeth was more of a cultural phenomenon than a real artist, serious artist. Even today, when realism has come back in vogue, there's a lot of hostility towards Andrew Wyeth's work. You either love him, and most people just hate him. And it's because their comments are unusually personal. The former Metropolitan Museum of Modern Art curator, Robert Storr, said in 2005 in an issue of Art News magazine that Andrew Wyeth's art is a very contrived version of what is true about simple Americans. I was born in Maine. I knew these people. I knew that nothing about Wyeth was honest. He said he always goes back to that manicured desolation. He's so reluctant to use color, to allow real air, the breath of nature, into his pictures. He said his paintings are as dead as a board. He tended to paint three subjects: still life vignettes, vessels like empty buckets, baskets, and thresholds, and views from open windows, mysterious half-open doors. He described all of these scenarios, these three subjects, as symbolism of the fragile nature of life. In Wyeth's paintings, he said, you always have a sense that there's something deeper going on. The paintings resonate with this highly personal symbolism that nobody else understands. The Metropolitan Museum of Art curator said this. Andrew said, I think it's what you take out of a picture that counts. There's a residue, an invisible shadow. Now, in this picture, the one that was bought in Philadelphia, the Museum of Art, called Groundhog Day, for instance, it portrays, you think, a cozy kitchen, but only gradually do you become aware that there's something off, something uncomfortable, something surreal about the painting. The only cutlery on the table is a knife. Outside of the window, there's this barbed wire fence, a jagged log that's wrapped in a chain. That all dominates the landscape. As Kathleen Foster notes in her essays about Wyeth, she said the painting adds up to a portrait of Wyatt's neighbor, the volatile, gun-loving Carl Koerner and his troubled wife. And from this cozy painting, it suggests violence, even madness, that simmers beneath the surface of their daily life. The places and objects and landscapes that he does are actually complex compositions, composites, where in Christina's world, for example, only her hands belong to Christina. The body is Betsy's. The hair belongs to one of the artist's aunts. Christina's shoe, it was something that he found in an old abandoned house and added it at the end just to add a little pizzazz to the painting. And while he is sometimes praised, he's more often criticized for painting every blade of grass in Christina's world, and it's in kind of an abstract look. The Metropolitan Museum of Art curator also said the field in Christina's world is closer to Jackson Pollock than most people would like to admit. As he aged, his work grew more surreal and more personal. One of his most blackly humorous paintings that he did in 1969 is called Snow Hill, and it depicts several of his favorite models, including Carl and Anna Koerner, Helga Tustorf, all dancing around the maypole celebrating his death. He said, I prefer winter and fall when you feel the bone structure of the landscape, the loneliness of it, the dead feeling of winter, something waits beneath, the whole story never really shows. But widespread acceptance among the critics, art historians, museum curators continues to elude him, and his place in history remains as one of intense debate. When art historian Robert Rosenblum was asked to name both the most overrated and underrated artist of the century, he nominated Andrew Wyeth for both categories. That divergence of opinion persists. Some see Wyeth as a major figure. Paul Johnson, for example, in his book Art History, describes him as the only narrative artist of genius during the second half of the 20th century. However, others decline to even mention him. Robert Storr, again, who was the former curator of painting at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, is openly hostile to his work. And Christina's world was omitted from the general handbook in the museum's masterworks, and still to this day it's not in the handbook. Over his career that has spanned 7 decades, and despite all the unenthusiastic commentary of the critics, Wyeth at 91 was still painting and produced a wealth of technically stunning paintings and drawings that have won him huge popular following and earned him a considerable fortune. Unfortunately, he died in his sleep on January 16, 2009 in Chadds Ford, Pennsylvania. He said, I don't want to repeat what I've done in the past. I've produced an awful lot of work in my life. I see no reason just to pile up more of it unless it's something that really shakes me inside. As I get older, I want to boil it all down to the very essence of my emotion. Instead of doing 20 pictures, I pour it all into one. All life experiences are endless and as they return to me. So in my paintings, there's a quiet tie-up and an echo of the past. He wrote that about his self-portrait. Whoops. And it's this. This is what he considers to be his self-portrait, a carry. And he describes it as a choppy river that flows through a bend onto a calm expanse of water, mirroring the tumultuousness of personal life during the Helga years, followed by more recent peacefulness. I'm going to go back to that other picture because I did want you to see this. His images of a timeless rural existence made him America's most popular living artist. No American painter has ever had such a strong hold on the popular imagination as Andrew Wyeth did over the course of a 7-decade career. Art critic Brian O'Doherty once noted that Wyeth communicates with his audience, numbered in the millions, with an ease and fluency that amounts to a kind of genius. Yet his popularity never translated into critical acclaim. He's dismissed outright in general. He was seen as a peripheral figure at best, an artistic relic. Some people, art critics, describe them as colored drawings, his paintings. The art critic Hilton Kramer once wrote this about his paintings: illustrated dreams that enable people who don't like art to fantasize about not living in the 20th century. Jamie Wyeth, Andrew's son, once compared his father's work to that of a poem by Robert Frost. He said at one level, it's all snowy woods and stone walls, and at another level, it's terrifying. And he exists at both levels. He's a very odd painter. What does Andrew Wyeth say about his own work? He said, I've often said if it was really good, I could have done the field of Christina's world without her in it. The less you have in a subject, the better the picture is. Now, at this time, I'd like to highlight some of the extraordinary talented artists that are known as the Wyeth family of artists. Jamie Wyeth, since his adolescence, has attracted considerable attention as the third-generation American artist, son of Andrew Wyeth, grandson of N.C. Wyeth. He is one of the country's most popular painters as the grandson of Newell Converse Wyeth. And he showed remarkable talent. He gained great recognition very early in life, and he began his formal training with his aunt Carolyn. Henrietta, N.C. Wyeth's first child, is considered by many scholars to be one of the great women painters of the 20th century. She began studying with her dad at the age of 11. She had a childhood bout with polio that crippled her right hand. Even so, she held the paintbrush between her first and second fingers, and she developed into a fine portraitist as a teenager. Incidentally, she is married to Peter Hurd, who moved to Chadds Ford and became a student of N.C. Wyeth as well. Peter Hurd commented that he went to West Point to go to school, but that N.C. Wyeth was tougher on him than West Point was. For the next 10 years, he lived and painted under the strict guidance of N.C. Wyeth. All of the Wyeths were quite taken by this very handsome, energetic young man in cowboy boots and a hat, but none as much as N.C. Wyeth's eldest daughter, Henrietta, who married him in 1929. Michael Hurd is their son. He's the youngest of Peter and Henrietta, a graduate of Stanford. He performed with the Kingston Trio for a while. He studied painting for several years with his mother, Henrietta. He's known as the unknown Wyeth. Caroline Wyeth, the second daughter of N.C., who demonstrated her talent at an early age, studied with her father for 19 years, longer than any of the other children. She painted the world that she knew best. N.C. called her the best painter in the family, the strongest woman artist in America today. And then Anne Wyeth McCoy grew up in music. She's the one who made those musical compositions. She was a musician, composer, as well as an artist. She had 3 children. 2 of them became painters. Her son became a filmmaker. She said, I never studied with anyone but Pa. My work is completely personal. I paint the things that I love. I paint my own life, and that's all. Incredibly, Nathaniel was known as the other Wyeth, which was her son. There are 2 other Wyeths. He invented he's the other Wyeth that wasn't a painter. He invented the process for manufacturing plastic bottles capable of holding carbonated beverages, which is a process that they still use in manufacturing plants today, Nathaniel. I'm sorry, that is N.C. Wyeth's son, not Anne's brother. This painting is also a self-portrait. It's unlike any of the other ones. It depicts a girl in thickly padded, leather-upholstered seat of a private airplane looking through an oval portal at a white house that happens to be the Olson house. This is Andrew Wyeth's plane, and that's Betsy, his wife. He explains that the airplane is used by the family to commute between homes in Pennsylvania and Maine, and this reveals something about this widely beloved painter that his art conceals, that his fame thrust him into the world of a wealthy landowner, and he lives in a well-insulated world of financial ease and privilege, and that's what he said about himself near the time of his death. And that's the story of Andrew Wyeth and the Wyeth family.
Thanks to the management and staff of the Hudson Library and Historical Society for their assistance in the production of this program and for providing the artist biographical series for the citizens of Hudson. For a DVD or Blu-ray copy of this or any HCTV program, contact Hudson Cable Television at 330-653-2500 or via email at hctv@hctv.org.